You think 9 Soviet hikers died in a blizzard on a mountain nobody feared. But blizzards do not get classified by the KGB. Blizzards do not cause a government to seal medical files, restrict an entire mountain range for 3 consecutive years, and quietly strip pages from a criminal case file before the families have even been properly notified. Their tent was cut open from the inside, not torn by the wind, not compressed by falling snow, cut with multiple incisions made with a knife from the interior by people who needed out of that canvas faster than they could reach the entrance. That is not a weather event. That is absolute panic. They ran barefoot in minus 30 degrees Celsius. 9 experienced, trained mountaineers abandoned every piece of equipment that would have kept them alive. Boots, coats, food, emergency gear, and fled into darkness they could not see through, down a slope they could barely feel beneath their feet. 2 of the recovered bodies showed traces of radioactive contamination. The KGB sealed the file. The same week, the last bodies were pulled from the snow. There is no version of a natural disaster that requires classified suppression as its official response. No blizzard, no avalanche, no atmospheric event on record demands that kind of institutional silence. But a weapons program does, and that is precisely where this investigation begins. The year was 1959. Nikita Khrushchev's Soviet Union was 14 months removed from Sputnik, and the state's grip on its own narrative was total. What got printed, what got filed, and what got found on a frozen mountain slope all moved through a bureaucratic apparatus that answered to one authority and tolerated no ambiguity that reflected poorly on the Soviet project. The Ural Mountains in February are not a backdrop. They are a killing ground. Temperatures plunge below minus 30 Celsius without announcement. Whiteout conditions can materialize within a single hour. Wind at exposed elevation regularly exceeds 60 kilometers per hour, compressing visibility to zero and wind chill to figures that carry no survivable value. None of that deterred 10 of the most capable young mountaineers from the Ural Polytechnic Institute in Sverdlovsk. They boarded a train on January 25th, loaded with technical equipment and a documented route plan, headed for Otorten Mountain, a Category 3 winter route, the highest civilian difficulty classification in the entire Soviet hiking system. This was not recreation. This was the kind of expedition that built institutional reputations and earned standing among serious mountaineers. What the hikers did not have on their route plan, what they had no formal way of knowing, was that the region they were entering was among the most heavily militarized territories in the Soviet Union. Within 200 kilometers of their route, multiple nuclear and ballistic research installations operated under wartime-level secrecy. The facility, designated Chelyabinsk 40, the Soviet Union's primary weapons-grade plutonium production plant, ran classified operations less than 300 kilometers to the south. The R-7 intercontinental ballistic missile program had been conducting active test launches across the northern Ural corridor throughout 1958 and into the early weeks of 1959. The Mansi people, indigenous to this landscape for generations, had a name for the specific mountain where those 10 hikers were heading. In the Mansi language, it translates directly as Dead Mountain. They were not speaking metaphorically. They had centuries of reason behind that name. The group departed with no reason to be afraid. That would become the last assumption any of them made. Igor Dyatlov was 23 years old. His instructors described him consistently, relentlessly precise, technically disciplined, a navigator who simply did not make errors. His peers trusted him not out of sentiment, but out of an accumulated record of performing correctly in difficult terrain under difficult conditions. Zenaida Kolmogorova was 22. The most experienced female mountaineer at the institute. She kept a personal diary throughout the trek. Search teams would recover it weeks after the group disappeared, frozen solid in the snow. Her final entry showed no sign of fear, no premonition, no indication that anything had gone or was going wrong. Just the ordinary language of a capable hiker settling in for a cold night. Ludmila Dubinina was 21. Her injuries would become the most forensically debated physical evidence in the case's entire documented history. And then there was Semyon Zolotarev, 38 years old, where every other member of the group was between 21 and 25. An outsider who joined a tight-knit group of friends and classmates just 2 weeks before departure. His name does not appear consistently across official records. Semyon in some documents, Alexander in others, a discrepancy never formally resolved. His military history included service in a World War II cipher unit. He arrived carrying 2 cameras when every other person on the expedition carried one. He photographed things his fellow hikers did not photograph. Some of his films were never recovered. Yuri Krivonishenko was 24, employed at the classified weapons facility Chelyabinsk, 40. That fact was omitted from the initial investigation summary, not overlooked, omitted. Yuri Yudin was the 10th member. On January 28th, 3 days into the trek, a deteriorating joint injury forced him to turn back. He was the only member of the group to come home alive. He lived until 2013. He spent 54 years carrying the question of what had happened to the 9 people he left behind on that mountain. The group made its final camp on the evening of February 1st, sometime between 11 p.m. on February 1st and 2 a.m. On February 2nd, something forced 9 people out of a tent on an open mountain slope in the dark. The exact trigger remains officially unresolved. What the physical evidence records is not unresolved. It is specific, sequential, and has been examined by forensic specialists across 6 decades of investigation and re-investigation. It does not accommodate comfortable conclusions. The tent was cut from the inside, not once. Multiple incisions, confirmed by the original 1959 investigation, were made from the interior with a cutting instrument. The pattern of cuts indicates people exiting through sliced openings rather than a single, controlled escape point. That level of urgency, multiple cuts, multiple exit attempts, does not emerge from a concern about snow load on the canvas above. It emerges from something that made the inside of that tent more immediately dangerous than minus 30 degrees Celsius on an exposed slope in the dark. They left everything, all 9 of them, boots, coats, emergency supplies, food, in varying states of undress, some barefoot on frozen ground. 5 bodies were recovered in March. Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, Slobodin, Doroshenko, and Krivonishenko found at intervals down the slope below the tent. 3 of them were oriented back toward the camp when they died, frozen mid-crawl, their bodies still aimed at the shelter they had failed to reach. Igor Dyatlov's arms were extended in the direction of the tent when search teams located him. In May, the snow released 4 more bodies from under 4 meters of compacted drift in a ravine 1.5 kilometers from the tent site. The forensic findings in that ravine changed the fundamental character of the case. Nikolai Thibault Brignol's bilateral skull fracture. Forensic examiner Boris Vozrozhdeny assessed the impact force required as equivalent to a high-speed vehicle collision. There was no external wound on the scalp, no bruise, no laceration, no abrasion of any kind. The skull fractured while the skin above it remained completely unmarked. Ludmila Dubinina, 5 broken ribs on the left side, severe internal hemorrhaging. Semyon Zolotarev, 6 broken ribs, the same bilateral compressive fracture pattern. In both bodies, 0 bruising, 0 abrasion, 0 external surface trauma of any kind. Internal compressive fracture without external wound is not the mechanical signature of avalanche burial. Avalanche dynamics generate a distributed surface pressure applied across the body. They bruise, they abrade, they leave evidence of external contact across the skin. They do not specifically produce severe fracture to the rib cage while leaving the surface unmarked. Explosive pressure waves do precisely that. Blast trauma at a distance produces exactly this pattern. Internal organ damage, bilateral bone fracture, and 0 surface wound. The compressive force required to reproduce the injuries found in Dubinina and Zolotarev has been forensically estimated at 4,000 to 5,000 newtons of sustained impact. Forensic records also indicate that Ludmila Dubinina had sustained notable soft tissue loss in the facial area. Boris Vozrojdeny formally recorded in his own field report that the soft tissue condition was inconsistent with decomposition timelines for the recovery period involved. The official case closure was issued on February 28, 1959. The 4 bodies in the ravine were still frozen under 4 meters of snow. The verdict: death caused by an unknown compelling natural force. That phrase has no forensic precedent in Soviet civilian or military jurisprudence. It does not name a mechanism. It does not identify a cause. It is not a scientific classification, and it is not a legal conclusion in any meaningful sense. It is a deliberately engineered vacancy, a door closed from the outside with the lights off. There was no press coverage, no public inquest, no named cause, no accountability to the 9 families whose children had walked into the mountains and never returned. Within 48 hours of the tense discovery on February 26, KGB personnel were embedded in the search operation. Families were instructed to maintain silence. Autopsy access was restricted. The official case file, case number H48, was transferred to the KGB Regional Archive in Sverdlovsk within weeks of the closure. Classified and sealed. It remained classified for 31 years. In 1990, lead investigator Lev Ivanov gave a public interview to Uralsky Raboshi, the Ural Worker newspaper, and stated what he had carried in silence for 3 decades. He was ordered to close the case. He was instructed to issue a conclusion that specified no cause. He was given no reason. He complied because the instruction came from people he did not refuse. And he knew, as he signed that report, that it did not reflect what the evidence had shown. When researchers accessed the partially declassified file in the 1990s, they discovered something that should have been structurally impossible within a sealed archive, pages bearing date stamps that post-dated the 1959 closure. The file had been entered and altered after the investigation was officially over. Documents had been added, removed, or modified by hands that accessed a supposedly sealed case record years, potentially decades, after it was supposed to be untouchable. In July 2019, Russian prosecutors reopened the Dyatlov case for the 3rd time in its history. Following a new investigation, the Russian Investigative Committee issued its official conclusion. The deaths were caused by a slab avalanche triggered by katabatic wind conditions descending the slope above the camp. The measured slope angle at the tent site was 15 to 20 degrees. Standard slab avalanche mechanics require a minimum trigger gradient of 30 degrees. The Russian government's own conclusion placed a slab avalanche on a slope too shallow to trigger one, by a margin that the physics of snow science does not dismiss lightly. A 2021 study published in Communications, Earth and Environment by researchers from the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology modeled the scenario computationally. Their simulation demonstrated that under very specific conditions of wind-packed snow density and delayed mechanical settlement, a slab event could theoretically initiate on gradients below standard thresholds. It was methodologically serious, peer-reviewed work, and within its own published text, the authors explicitly acknowledged that the slope was at the lower end of trigger gradients. The study did not attempt to account for the internal rib fracture pattern. The question of compressive injury without an external wound was not addressed. Declassified Soviet military radar logs from February 1959, referenced in research by historian Alexei Koskin, record multiple unidentified aerial contacts tracked over the northern Ural corridor during the first 2 weeks of that month. At least 9 independent witnesses, including Mansi guides and Soviet military personnel stationed in the region, separately reported luminous aerial phenomena above the mountains on or around the night of February 1st to February 2nd. The accounts vary in specifics, but converge on a single geographic area and a single narrow window of time. Yuri Krivonashenko's recovered clothing retained beta-emitting radioactive isotopes at levels the 1959 forensic report documented. as consistent with occupational contamination at a military nuclear facility. His employer was Chelyabinsk 40. Semyon Zolotarev's recovered photography included nighttime exposure frames showing unidentified light sources above the tree line. Part of his film was never recovered. Here is what the forensic record shows when the political layer is stripped away. 9 trained, experienced, capable people abandoned the only shelter between themselves and a lethal mountain in absolute panic. They were not responding to the snow. A snow response means you grab what you need. You pull on your boots. You take your coat and your survival pack. You do not run barefoot into minus 30 degrees Celsius with your cold weather gear still folded inside the tent, unless what is behind you represents a more immediate and more lethal threat than the open mountain ahead of you. The injuries to Dubinina, Zolotarev, and Thibault Brignol required a force that no blizzard, no avalanche, and no documented animal encounter on this planet delivers in that specific mechanical pattern. Internal compressive trauma, bilateral fracture, and 0 external wound across 3 separate individuals recovered from the same location. That pattern is not disputed as a description of what was found. What is disputed is what caused it, and no theory currently advanced by any official body has provided a mechanically complete answer. The KGB did not seal this file to protect a mystery. Mysteries do not require institutional suppression. They sealed it to protect a program, whether that program involved the detonation of a ballistic test vehicle, an infrasonic weapons experiment, or a classified military operation whose collateral damage left 9 bodies across an exposed slope in the northern Urals in the early hours of February 2, 1959. The word officially is carrying an extraordinary weight in that sentence. The Dyatlov Foundation continues to formally advocate for full, unredacted declassification of every KGB file and military intelligence record connected to this case. As of 2025, the Russian government has not released the complete, unredacted archive for case number H48 or any associated military operational records from February 1959. Yuri Yudin, the sole survivor, the man who walked away, stated publicly in 2012, "I am certain there was an external factor. A natural force does not do what was done to them. He knew who they were. He knew exactly what they were capable of. He was certain. 9 names, 1 sealed file. 6 decades of a state investing everything in an answer you were never supposed to find. But the archives never forget. If this investigation reached you, share it. Subscribe to Archival Noir, because next we open the file on Novicherkassk, 1962, the Soviet massacre of civilian workers that Khrushchev's government spent 30 years erasing from every official record it could reach. Drop a comment. KGB cover-up or military accident. The evidence is on the table. What's buried always surfaces. Until next time, stay blessed.